Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with another live stream. We are doing PittCast again today, and we are going to be talking again about the Federalist Papers. We will be diving into papers 8 through 10 and discussing why it's a good idea to have domestic tranquility, why we as citizens should do everything that we can to ensure that domestic tranquility exists and perpetuates throughout the rest of the country, because we are stronger together. I believe in energetic investment. So this is an energetic investment into the founding principles of this country. I am speaking them aloud so that they will once again come into being around us. With that being said, let's dive into the papers. This is from the New York Packet, Tuesday, November 20th of 1787 by Alexander Hamilton. To the people of the state of New York. Assuming it therefore an established truth that several states, in case of disunion or such combination of them as might happen to be formed out of the wreck of the general confederacy, would be subject to those vicissitudes of peace and war, of friendship and enmity with each other, which have fallen to the lot of all neighboring nations not united under one government. Let us enter into concise detail of some of the consequences that would attend such a situation. War between the states in the first period of their separate existence would be accompanied with much greater distresses than it commonly is in those countries where regular military establishments have long obtained. The disciplined armies always kept on foot on the continent of Europe, though they bear a malignant aspect to liberty and economy, have, notwithstanding, been productive of the signal advantage of rendering sudden conquest impracticable, and of preventing that rapid desolation which used to mark the progress of war to their introduction, prior to their introduction. The art of fortification has contributed to the same ends. The nations of Europe are encircled with chains of fortified places, which mutually obstruct invasion. Campaigns are wasted in reducing 2 or 3 frontier garrisons to gain admittance into an enemy's country. Similar impediments occur at every step to exhaust the strength and delay the progress of an invader. Formerly, an invading army would penetrate into the heart of a neighboring country almost as soon as intelligence of its approach could be received. But now, a comparatively small force of disciplined troops, acting on the defensive with the aid of posts, is able to impede and finally to frustrate the enterprises of one much more considerable. The history of war in that quarter of the globe is no longer a history of nations subdued and empires overturned, but of towns overtaken, towns taken and retaken, of battles that decide nothing, of retreats more beneficial than victories, of much effort and little acquisition. In this country, the scene would be altogether reversed. The jealousy of military establishments would postpone them as long as possible. The want of fortifications leaving the frontiers of one state open to another would facilitate inroads. The populous states would, with little difficulty, overrun their less populous neighbors. Conquest would be as easy to be made as difficult to be retained. War, therefore, would be desultory and predatory. Plunder and devastation ever march in the train of irregulars. The calamities of individuals would make the principal figure in the events which would characterize our military exploits. This picture is not too highly wrought, though I confess it would not long remain a just one. Safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. Even the ardent love of liberty will, after a time, give way to its dictates. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war, the continual effort and alarm attendant on a state of continual danger, will compel nations, the most attached to liberty, to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. To be more safe, they at length become willing to run the risk of being less free. The institutions chiefly alluded to are standing armies and the correspondent appendages of military establishments. Standing armies, it is said, are not provided against in the new Constitution, and it is therefore inferred that they may exist under it. Their existence, however, from the very terms of the proposition, is at most problematical and uncertain. But standing armies, it may be replied, must inevitably result from a dissolution of the Confederacy. Frequent war and constant apprehension, which require a state as a constant preparation, will infallibly produce them. The weaker states or confederacies would first have recourse to them to put themselves upon an equality with their more potent neighbors. They would endeavor to supply the inferiority of population and resources by a more regular and effective system of defense, by disciplined troops, and by fortifications. They would, at the same time, be necessitated to strengthen the executive arm of the government, in doing which their constitutions would acquire a progressive direction towards monarchy. It is the nature of war to increase the executive at the expense of the legislative authority. I wonder why we're at war right now. I wonder. The expedients which have been mentioned would soon give the states or confederacies that made use of them a superiority over their neighbors, small states or states of less natural strength. Under vigorous governments, with the assistance of disciplined armies, have often triumphed over large states, or states of greater natural strength, which have been destitute of these advantages. Neither the pride nor the safety of the more important states or confederacies would permit them long to submit to this mortifying and adventitious superiority. They would quickly resort to means similar to those by which it had been effected to reinstate themselves in their lost preeminence. Thus, we should, in a little time, see established in every part of this country the same engines of despotism which have been the scourge of the old world. This, at least, would be the natural course of things, and our reasoning would be more likely to be just, in proportion as they are accommodated to this standard. These are not vague inferences drawn from a supposed or speculative defects in a constitution, the whole power of which is lodged in the hands of a people, and their representatives or delegates, but they are solid conclusions drawn from the natural and necessary progress of human affairs. It may perhaps be asked, by way of objection to this, why did not standing armies spring up out of the contentions which so often distracted the ancient republics of Greece? Different answers, equally satisfactory, may be given to this question. The industrious habits of the people of the present day, absorbed in the pursuits of gain and devoted to the improvements of agriculture and commerce, are incompatible with the condition of a nation of soldiers, which was the true condition of the people of those republics. The means of revenue, which have been so greatly multiplied by the increase of gold and silver, of the arts of industry, and the science of finance, which is the offspring of modern times, concurring with the habits of nations, have produced an entire revolution in the system of war, and have rendered disciplined armies, distinct from the body of the citizens, the inseparable companions of frequent hostility. There is a wide difference also between military establishments in a country seldom exposed to its situation to internal invasions, and in one which is often subject to them and always apprehensive of them. The rulers of the former can have a good pretext, if they are so inclined, to keep on foot armies so numerous as must of necessity be maintained in the latter. These armies being, in the first case, rarely, if at all, called into activity for interior defense, the people are in no danger of being broken to military subordination. The laws are not accustomed to relaxations in favor of military exigencies. The civil state remains in full vigor, neither corrupted nor confounded with the principles or propensities of the other state. The smallness of the army renders the natural strength of the community an overmatch for it, and the citizens, not habituated to look up to the military power for protection or to submit to its oppressions, neither love nor fear the soldiery. They view them with a spirit of jealous acquiescence in necessary evil, and stand ready to resist a power which they may suppose may be exerted to the prejudice of their rights. The army, under such circumstances, may usefully aid the magistrate to suppress a small faction or an occasional mob or insurrection, but it will be unable to enforce encroachments against the united efforts of the great body of people. But it will be unable to enforce encroachments against the united efforts of the great body of people. In a country in the predicament last described, the contrary of all this happens. The perpetual menacings of danger oblige the government to be always prepared to repel it. Its armies must be numerous enough for instant defense. The continual necessity for their services enhances the importance of the soldier and proportionably degrades the conditions of the citizen. The military state becomes elevated above the civil. The inhabitants of territories, often the theater of war, are unavoidably subjected to frequent infringement on their rights, which serve to weaken their sense of those rights. And by degrees, the people are brought to consider the soldiery, not only as their protectors, but as their superiors. The transition from this disposition to that of considering them masters is neither remote nor difficult, but it is very difficult to prevail upon a people under such impressions to make a bold or effectual resistance to usurpation supported by the military power. The kingdom of Great Britain falls within the first description, an insular situation and a powerful marine, guarding it in a great measure against the possibility of foreign invasion, supersede the necessity of a numerous army within the kingdom, a sufficient force to make head against a sudden descent, till the militia could have time to rally and embody, is all that has been deemed requisite. No motive of national policy has been demanded, nor would public opinion have tolerated a larger a larger number of troops upon its domestic establishment. There has been, for a long time past, little room for the operation of the other causes, which have been enumerated as the consequences of an eternal war. This particular felicity of situation has, in a great degree, contributed to preserve the liberty which that country to this day enjoys, in spite of the prevalent venality and corruption. If, on the contrary, Britain had been situated on the continent and had been compelled, as she would have been, by that situation, to make her military establishments at home coextensive with those of the other great powers of Europe, she, like them, would in all probability be, at this day, a victim to the absolute power of a single man. It is possible, though not easy, that the people of that island may be enslaved from other causes, but it cannot be by the prowess of an army so inconsiderable as that which has been usually kept up within the kingdom. If we are wise enough to preserve the Union, we may for ages enjoy an advantage similar to that of an insulated situation. Europe is at a great distance from us. Her colonies in our vicinity would be likely to continue too much disproportioned in strength to be able to give us any dangerous annoyance. Extensive military establishments cannot, in this position, be necessary to our security. But if we should be disunited and the integral parts should either remain separated or, which is the more probable, should be thrown together into 2 or 3 confederacies, we should be, in short course of time, in the predicament of the continental powers of Europe. Our liberties would be a prey to the means of defending ourselves against the ambition and jealousy of each other. This is not an idea this is an idea not superficial or futile, but solid and weighty. It deserves the most serious and mature consideration of every prudent and honest man of whatever party. If such men will make a firm and solemn pause and meditate dispassionately on the importance of this interesting idea, if they will contemplate it in all its attitudes and trace it to all its consequences, they will not hesitate to part with trivial objections to a constitution, the rejection of which would, in all probability, put a final period to the Union. That flit before the distempered imaginations of some of its adversaries would quickly give place to the more substantial forms of dangers, real, certain, and formidable. And so ends number 8. So this seems to be something that we're living through yet again, right? We have standing armies, and there is a great argument that is happening, fathers. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this reading, is to get the clear intention, and it is the clear intention of the people who were trying to sell the Constitution to the populace what was to be, right? Yes, we need a standing army, but that's not for the populace. It should never be for the populace, except in a few select extreme circumstances. Not some arbitrary thing that you just throw out, not some arbitrary word that would probably get me banned from this interwebs, but instead, it is for the defense of the homeland from external sources. If we have problems internally, we're supposed to take care of it. And the military is supposed to stand down. The military is not meant to be a block from the united effort of a united people. If only we could unite. But now we're going to do the Federalist 9. This is for the Independent Journal by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. A firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. It is possible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated, and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. If they exhibit occasional calms, these only serve as short-lived contrast to the furious storms that are to succeed. If now and then intervals of felicity open to view, we behold them with a mixture of regret, arising from the reflection that the pleasing scenes before us are soon to be overwhelmed by the tempestuous waves of sedition and party rage. If momentary rays of glory break forth from the gloom and they dazzle us with a transient and fleeting brilliancy, they at the same time admonish us to lament that the vices of government should pervert the direction and tarnish the luster of those bright talents and exalted endowments for which the favored soils that produce them have been so justly celebrated. From the disorders that disfigured the annals of those republics, the advocates of despotism have drawn arguments, not only against the forms of republican government, but against the very principles of civil liberty. They have decried all free government as inconsistent with the order of society and have indulged themselves in malicious exultation over its friends and partisans. Happily for mankind, stupendous fabrics reared on the basis of liberty, which have flourished for ages, have, in a few glorious instances, refuted their gloomy sophisms. And I trust America will be the broad and solid foundation of other edifices, not less magnificent, which will be equally permanent monuments of their errors. But it is not to be denied that the portraits they have sketched of republican government were, too, just copies of the originals from which they were taken. If it had been found impracticable to have devised models of a more perfect structure, The enlightened friend to liberty would have obliged to abandon the cause of that species of government as indefensible. The science of politics, however, like most other sciences, has received great improvement. The efficacy of various principles is now well understood, which were either not known at all or imperfectly known to the ancients. The regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election. These are wholly new discoveries, or have made their principal progress towards perfection in modern times. They are means and powerful means by which the excellences of Republican government may be retained and its imperfections lessened or avoided. To this catalog of circumstances that tend to the amelioration of popular systems of civil government, I shall venture, however novel it may appear to some, that to add one more on a principle which has been made the foundation of an objection to the new Constitution. I mean the enlargement of the orbit within which such systems are to revolve, either in respect to the dimensions of a single state or to the consolidation of several smaller states into one greater confederacy. The latter is that which immediately concerns the object under consideration. It will, however, be of use to examine the principle in its application to a single state, which shall be attended to in another place. The utility of confederacy, as well as to suppress faction and to guard the internal tranquility of states as to increase their external force and security, is in reality not a new idea. It has been practiced upon in different countries and ages, and has received the sanction of the most approved writers on the subject of politics. The opponents of the plan proposed have, with great assiduity, cited and circulated the observations of Montesquieu on the necessity of contracted territory for a republican government. But they seem not to have been apprised of the sentiments of that great man expressed in another part of his work, nor to have adverted the consequences of the principle to which they subscribe with such ready acquiescence. When Montesquieu recommends for a small extent for republics, the standards he had in view were of dimensions far short of the limits of almost every one of these states. Neither Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, North Carolina, nor Georgia can by any means be compared with the models from which he reasoned and to which the terms of his description apply. If we therefore take his ideas on this point as the criterion for truth, we shall be driven to the alternative, either of taking refuge at once in the arms of monarchy, or of splitting ourselves into an infinity of little, jealous, clashing, tumultuous commonwealths, the wretched nurseries of unceasing discord, and the miserable objects of universal pity or contempt. Some of the writers who have come forward on the other side of the question seem to have been aware of the dilemma, and have even been bold enough to hint at the division of the larger states as a desirable thing. Such an infatuated policy, such a desperate expedient might, by the multiplication of petty offices, answer the views of men who possess not qualifications to extend their influence beyond the narrow circles of personal intrigue, but it could never promote the greatness or happiness of the people of America. Referring the examination of the principle itself to another place, as has already been mentioned, will be sufficient to remark here that, in the sense of the author who has been most emphatically quoted upon the occasion, it would only dictate a reduction of the size of the more considerable members of the Union, but it would not militate against their being all comprehended into one Confederate government. And this is the true question, and the discussion of which we are at present interested. So far are the suggestions of Montague from standing in opposition to a general union of the states that he explicitly treats of a confederate republic as the expedient for extending the sphere of a popular government and reconciling the advantages of monarchy with those of republicanism. It is very probable, says he, that mankind would have been obliged at length to live constantly under the government of a single person had they not contrived of a constitution that has all of the internal advantages of a republican, together with the external force of a monarchical government. I mean, a confederate republic. This form of government is a convention by which several smaller states agree to become members of a larger one, which they intend to form. It is a kind of assemblage of societies that constitute a new one, capable of increasing by means of new associations till they arrive to such a degree of power as to be able to provide for the security of the united body. A republic of this kind, able to withstand an external force, may support itself without any internal corruptions. The forms of this society prevents all manners of inconveniences. If a single member should attempt to usurp the supreme authority, he could not be supposed to have an equal authority and credit in all the Confederate States. Were he to have too great of an influence over one, this would alarm the rest. Were he to subdue a part, that which would still remain free might oppose him, with forces independent of those which he had usurped, and overpower him before he could be settled in his usurpation. Should a popular insurrection happen in one of the Confederate States, the others are able to quell it. Should abuses creep into one part, they are reformed by those that remain sound. The state may be destroyed on one side and not on the other. The Confederacy may be dissolved, and the Confederates preserve their sovereignty. As this government is composed of small republics, it enjoys the internal happiness of each. And with respect to its external situation, it is possessed, by means of the association, of all the advantages of larger monarchies. I have thought it proper to quote at length these interesting passages because they contain luminous abridgment of the principal arguments in favor of the Union, and must effectually remove the false impressions which a misapplication of the other parts of the work were calculated to make. They have, at the same time, an intimate connection with the more immediate design of this paper, which is to illustrate the tendency of the Union to repress domestic faction and insurrection. A distinction, more subtle than accurate, has been raised between a confederacy and a consolidation of the states. The essential characteristic of the first is said to be the restriction of its authority to the members in their collective capacities, without reaching to any of the individuals of whom they are composed. It is contended that the National Council ought have no concern with any object of internal administration. An exact equality of suffrage between the members has also been insisted upon as a leading feature of a Confederate government. These positions are, in the main, arbitrary. They are supported neither by principle nor precedent. It has indeed happened that governments of this kind have generally operated in the manner which the distinction takes notice of, supposes to be inherent in their nature. But there have been, in most of them, extensive exceptions to the practice, which serve to prove, as far as the example will go, that there is no absolute rule on the subject. And it will be clearly shown in the course of this investigation that, as far as the principle contended for has prevailed, it has been the cause of incurable disorder and imbecility in the government. The distinction of a Confederate republic seems to be an assemblage of societies, or an association of two or more states in one state. The extent, modifications, and objects of the federal authority are mere matters of discretion, so long as the separate organization of the members not be abolished, so long as it exists by a constitutional necessity for local purposes, though it should be in perfect subordination to the general authority of the Union. It would still be, in fact and in theory, an association of states or a confederacy. The proposed Constitution, so far from implying an abolition of state governments, makes them constituent parts of the national sovereignty by allowing them a direct representation in the Senate, and leaves in their possession certain exclusive and very important portions of sovereign power. This fully corresponds in every rational import of the terms with the idea of a federal government. In the Lycian Confederacy, which consisted of 23 cities or republics, the largest were entitled to 3 votes in the Common Council, those of the middle class to 2, and the smallest to 1. The Common Council had the appointment of all the judges and magistrates of the respective cities. This was certainly the most delicate species of interference in their internal administration, for if there be anything that seems exclusively appropriated to the local jurisdictions, it is the appointment of their own officers. Yet, Montesquieu, speaking of this association, says, "Were I to give a model of an excellent Confederate republic, it would be that of Lycia." Thus we perceive that the distinctions insisted upon were not with the contemplation of this enlightened civilian, and we shall be led to conclude that they are the novel refinements of an erroneous theory. And so ends Federalist number 9. And again, this is just showing us why we are stronger together. We are stronger when we share values, yes. We're stronger when we share borders, but we're stronger when we have the common goal of peace and harmony, with not allowing the deviations to take over the republic. That's a big one right now because we have several deviations, and I can't get into too many details as to where they are, but I bet you can guess. They all have blue on the map. And even if they're in a red state, the blue cities are just as bad. That is a problem. Part of it is built into the system. We are supposed to be progressing. That is a good thing. We're not supposed to stagnate. We're supposed to make progress. And so we need progressives, but we're not supposed to allow them to destroy our conservative values, the things upon which we have been built upon, which are outlined here quite clearly. No interference from the federal government in internal affairs is what it just said. Like, it just told us that the federal government is for the dealing with external forces, and only by necessity does it deal with the internals, right? If this state has a problem with this state, then the federal government is to mediate between the states, not to dictate to them anything, but to mediate between them, because you're supposed to be living in a sovereign state. Your governor, who you vote for, is supposed to have your best interests at heart, not the United States, yours, in your state. And every single state should be that way. Everybody should be fighting for their homes. That should be where we are. That should be who we are as a people. And somehow we've managed to forget that, although we have reminders, we have resources available for us to go back and look at. Do you know how unique that is? Despite the uniqueness of the experiment that is the freedom we enjoy, right? The right to self-determination was not a thing. You had to ask somebody to move. Even if it was to the next city, you had to go, "Hey, boss, can I move? Is it okay if I move to that house over there, please? My roof's leaking. Can I move over there, please? It's a real thing, and it wasn't restricted to one type of person. Everybody was owned, unless you were the 1% at the very top who owned the people. Then you were owned too, and you did not get to go where you wanted. You didn't get to choose your job. Somebody chose that for you. We have a unique experiment in freedom here where you can just go. You can go wherever. If you don't like your state and the way they act, you can move to another one. And yet we will still act in the common defense. We still hold common values. That is our strength, right? The diversity of the states is a built-in thing. The diversity of our populace, it's a built-in thing. We are stronger when we're diverse, but we shouldn't be making diversity decisions based upon melanin levels or genitalia. That's just silly. Federalist 10. From the New York Packet, Friday, November 23rd, 1787. Author James Madison. To the people of the state of New York. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to his dangerous vice. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have, in truth, been the mortal disease under which popular governments everywhere have perished, as they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired, but it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have effectually obviated the danger on this side, as was wished and expected. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens. Equally, the friends of public and private faith and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflict of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided, not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. However, however anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. It will be found, indeed, on a candid review of our situation, that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments, but it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for the many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factitious spirit has tainted our public administrations. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of the other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction, the one by removing its causes, and the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction, the one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, and the other by giving every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment but without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts its fire to destructive agency. The second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. The diversity and the facilities of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interest. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties to acquiring property, the possession of differing degrees of kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity. According to the different circumstances of civil society, a zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well of speculation as a practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with a mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion prevents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and to excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms a principal task of modern legislation, and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interests would certainly bias the judgment, and not improbably corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet, what are many of the most important acts of legislation? But so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens. And what are the different classes of legislators, but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? Is a law proposed concerning private debts? Is it a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other? Justice ought to hold the balance between them. Yet the parties are, and must be, themselves the judges. and the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged, and in what degree, by restrictions on foreign manufacturers? Are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and the manufacturing classes, and probably by neither with a sole regard to justice and to the public good. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality. Yet there is, perhaps, no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pockets. It is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will not be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations, which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of a whole. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. When a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of the other citizens. To secure the public good and private rights against such danger, against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government. It is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Let me add that it is the greater desideratum, I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. This is my first time reading this. So, by which this form of government can be rescued from the opprobrium under which it has so long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. By what means is this object obtainable? Evidently by one of two only, either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered, by their number and local situation, unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If the impulse of the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as adequate control. They are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals, and lose their efficiency in proportion to the number combined together, that is, in proportion as their efficiency becomes needful. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have, in general, been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would, at the same time, be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. A republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficiency which it must derive from the union. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government, and the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens, the greater sphere of the country, over which the latter may be extended. The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views, by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. On the other hand, the effect may be inverted. Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister designs may, by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means, first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. The question resulting is whether small or extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal. And it is clearly decided in the favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. In the first place, it is to be remarked that, however small the republic may be, the representatives must be raised to a certain number in order to guard against the cabals of a few, and that, however large it may be, they must be limited to a certain number in order to guard against the confusion of a multitude. Hence, the number of representatives in the two cases not being in proportion to that of the two constituents, and being proportionally greater in the small republic, it follows that, if the proportion of fit characters be not less in the large than in the small republic, the former will present a greater option, and consequently a greater probability of a fit choice. In the next place, as each representative will be chosen by the greater number of citizens in large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried, and the suffrages of the people being more free will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established characters. It must be confessed that in this, as in most other cases, there is a mean, on both sides of which inconveniences will be found to lie. By enlarging too much the number of electors, you render the representatives too little acquainted with all their local circumstances and lesser interests. And by reducing it too much, you render him unduly attached to these, and too little fit to comprehend and pursue great and national objects. The federal constitution forms a happy combination in this respect, the great and aggregate interest being referred to the national, the local, and particular to the state legislatures. The other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of a republican than of democratic republican government. It is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily they will concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or, if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrence is necessary. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by the Union over the states composing it. Does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudice and schemes of injustice? It will not be denied that the representation of the Union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. Does it consist in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? In an equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within the Union increase this security? Does it, in fine, consist in the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and increased majority? Here, again, the extent of the Union gives it the most palpable advantage. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration to other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any of the other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. And the same proportion of such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. And the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we hold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government, and according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans, ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists. And so we wrap up 10. This is the end of 10. So this is the first section. There are more letters to come, but this is the first section. It is outlining the reason for the Union. It outlines our defense against external sources. It outlines our strength against internal sources. It outlines our need to stay away from the paper fiat system. It outlines the fact that people will want to take your property and distribute it. It outlines the fact that we have so many of these problems today that they had then. And the cure to it is knowledge. The more you know, the harder it is to hide, right? And the more light is shined on the subject, the less you are able to hide in the minutia. It is obvious when reading through the Federalist Papers the direction that this country was supposed to be. As much individual sovereignty as possible. You, in particular, should be able to Do what you want to do with your life without exception, as long as you are not interfering with someone else. You should be able to pursue your happiness, but not be guaranteed its success. The American dream is not to have a house. It's not to have a chicken in the pot. The American dream is to be able to chase the house and the chicken, to be able through your own facilities to enable yourself to get what you want out of life with nobody taking from you. We've got a lot of people crying these days about pay your fair share and equitable distribution, while they are perfectly content to sit at a minimum wage job with zero responsibility. And that is what most of them are. We have somehow, as a nation, acquired an aversion to education and responsibility, the two cornerstones upon which this entire country is built. Everything we have is because free men chose to be freely educated and to use that education for the benefit of others and not just themselves. We tend to lose sight of that every couple of decades, and we need to be reminded of that every couple of decades. But the republic should stand as one. We might need to get rid of the fiat system, but that's going to be difficult. Not going to be an easy thing. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. It's not too hard to read through these and understand what they mean. They do quite plainly express what we are supposed to be thinking about. Right? This tells us in no uncertain terms where we're supposed to be as a nation, and we're not doing it. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.